Welcome back. I have Dr. Delia McCabe here, and she's joining me from Australia. Good morning, Delia.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for the invite. I'm really, really delighted to be here.
Well, it's a privilege to have you here. And your journey is really interesting to me because while I believe the mind plays a crucial role in health and wellness, it is so obvious that the brain and body need more than just thoughts and words to function optimally. So tell me about how you transitioned from psychology to writing a book about nourishing your brain with food.
I love this question because when someone gets this, it's phenomenal to me because it does seem to be self-evident, doesn't it?
It does.
It does. But I'm going to date myself now because it was more than 25 years ago that I was busy doing my master's in clinical psych. And I was working with a group of really smart school kids, some of whom were doing very well at school and some of whom were failing. You know, those kids where the parents and the teachers are beside themselves because the kids can do really well and they're not doing well.
Yeah.
So in my naivety and my relative youth, I was looking at the psychological variables that underpinned their underachievement. So I developed a number of questionnaires, and in one of the questionnaires, as fate would have it, I had a little bit of extra space, and I thought, well, let me just throw in a question about food, because my husband had just invested in a health food store, and I was really, top of mind about food and how it impacts us, and I just threw this question in there, Ryan. And so all the kids in my experimental group, that's the really smart kids who were doing poorly, loved junk food. And all the kids in my control group who were smart kids doing well didn't love junk food. They liked Sunday roast and, roasted chicken and so on. And I was like, wow. So once again, fate stepped in because I was very pregnant with my first child. And I thought, wow, I'm going to take a little bit of time off to investigate this. I didn't write it up in my thesis because that wasn't anything to do with my hypothesis. I just kept it in the back of my head. And I thought, let's check out this, food in the brain angle. And that led down the path of actually doing some serious introspection and saying to myself, I don't want to try and help people talk themselves better and look at the psychological variables first. I want to see if their brain is well nourished or not. Because I figured, even although I was still pretty naive and young, I figured, look, if the brain is not well nourished, all of those wonderful mindset shifts and all of those wonderful plans and, procedures and strategies you give a brain, if it's not well nourished, it's not going to be able to maximize all that great info. So I really stepped back and then I went and had to dig and really stepped away from our colleagues who were really into the talking cure, and I was off on another path.
So what specifically was the question you asked?
I said, what is your favorite food? It was such a simple question, and it really changed my destiny. And I really wish that I could step back into that time and say to these kids, hey guys, let's look at what you're eating, because I didn't do that. I looked at all the other variables that were affecting them. It was never ever a question of what did you have for breakfast? Maybe that's why you can't focus and concentrate. Maybe that's why learning is a challenge. Maybe that's why mood is a challenge. I wasn't in that headspace yet. So a simple question and a destiny shift.
Yeah, this is really interesting to me because we were talking earlier and I had mentioned to you that my grandfather had heart surgery recently. And while he was having heart surgery, he had a stroke. So I went in and I was talking to the doctors and they had like a little lunch and learn with a neuropsychologist at the hospital. And I went with my grandfather, and as a podcaster talking about optimizing your body, I was interested in maybe some fringe or at least like really aggressive treatments in terms of like fueling the brain to recover from a stroke. And I asked this neuropsychologist, I said, are there certain foods or diets that someone that has a stroke that's battling brain issues could have to kind of like help recover from the trauma that just happened to their brain? And wouldn't you know it, the neuropsychologist looked at me and he said, a well-balanced diet. He really didn't give it the time of day. It's almost like he wasn't thinking about it. And me, who has kind of looked into nutrition a little bit, I remember asking him the question. I said, well, don't certain foods like help nutrients cross that blood-brain barrier? And he kind of looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I'm thinking, how does this guy not know what the blood-brain barrier is? And maybe he did, but he was just like, no, it's just a balanced diet. And then I asked him about ketones, and I asked him about glucose and how these things affect the brain. And he was like, he didn't really give it much thought, and he couldn't really tell me about it. Okay, perfect. So let me ask you, is there a certain diet or a certain way of eating that helps beneficial nutrients cross the blood-brain barrier? And furthermore, is this even a valid question, or should I not be concerned about it?
It's a valid question, but we just need to step back for a moment, because let's just look at what the brain needs to function optimally. Okay. And the first thing that hit me 25 years ago was that 60% of the dry weight of the brain is fat. Okay. That's 60% of the dry weight. So if you take out all the water, what you're left with is 60% fat. But
really,
and this is, that was amazing to me, because I thought to myself, look, I better just find out about fats and oils pretty quickly, because they're obviously important to the brain. And I thought it would take me a couple of weeks. And I can honestly tell you, 25 years later, I'm still learning, Ryan, because this is the most complex topic in nutrition. But just to step back, 60% dry weight fat. But of that 60%, 20 to 25% needs to be made of a specific kind of fat, which is polyunsaturated fat. That's omega-3 and omega-6, which we cannot make in our body, like we can make saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. We have to get omega-3 and omega-6 via our diet. Now, the reason they are so important for brain function is because of their molecular structure. And I won't go into neurochemistry 101 here, but the important thing to keep in mind is that it's actually the shape of the fat that makes sure it functions in the brain and allows the brain to work optimally, including the electrochemical impulses that drive communication. If we don't have the right kinds of fats, then the structure of the neurons is impacted, okay? The membrane of that neuron needs to be very flexible and very malleable, and the shape of those two kinds of fats affect how the neuron functions, communicates, and also how neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers in the brain, get created and how they jump across the synapse. Because neurons never really touch each other, which is part of the magic of the brain. They speak to each other over a little gap. And those little synapses are made up of a high percentage of this fat, which allows the neurotransmitters to jump and work properly. So that's kind of like the background. Then when we speak about the nutrients that the brain needs to function optimally, specific nutrients are required to create the energy that the brain uses, okay? And those nutrients are used to create energy from the carbohydrates we eat, which get converted into glucose, which is the brain's preferred source of fuel. Now, I know you mentioned the word ketones earlier, and a lot of people are on ketogenic diets and diets that allow their body to not have carbs and use ketones as a source of fuel. Interestingly, the research on using ketones for brain health is not very robust in relation to long-term studies, but we know that when the brain becomes compromised in its ability to use glucose, which happens with things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So basically, the neurons can't use glucose really well then. So then what happens if we allow the brain to shift to use ketones as a source of fuel instead, the brain seems to like that. But there's not enough long-term research to show that ketones are better than carbs. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is that ketones do not contain, they're not from the omega-3 and the omega-6 family. Most people are getting ketones from saturated fat. That's the first point. The second point is carbohydrates that we eat don't just contain carbs and glucose. They also contain a whole lot of nutrients, because the foods that we eat that contain carbs, the healthy ones, also contain Bs, and they contain fat-soluble antioxidants, and they contain water-soluble antioxidants like vitamin C. And they also contain things like magnesium and zinc, and those are all critically important for the brain. So that was just a little diversion there.
Yeah. So the omega-3s and omega-6, that's, to me, is that fish oil? Like something like that? Is that like...
Okay. This is a good question, and it's a little bit of a complex answer. So here we go. When you consume fish oil,
Okay.
I've got a chart that I put in my book, and I actually created the chart 25 years ago because I had to keep track of what I was looking at. I was like, hey, is that a monounsaturated fat? What is that? Is that a saturated or is it an omega-3? So I created this chart, and the chart really explains it really clearly. But here we go. If you only use fish oil, you are getting the derivative of omega-3. So let me just step back a moment. Plant-based forms of omega-3 are things like flax seeds, chia seeds, dark green leafy veg, and so on. Those are the concentrated forms, and hemp seed, concentrated forms of omega-3. The body then does something amazing. It takes those compounds, which are actually called alpha-linolenic acids, it takes them, and if you have enough of the coenzyme factors, which are B3, B6, vitamin C, magnesium, and zinc, if you've got enough of that lot, then your body brilliantly, in its wisdom, converts that plant-based form of omega-3 into DHA and EPA, which you find in fish oil. Okay. So when people eat fish oil, they are consuming the derivative without the body having made it. Now,
so it's better or stronger or different than if you were just to eat chia seeds, flaxseed, leafy greens?
Good question, and an important one to answer. It is not better to be consuming fish oil because you don't actually know how much DHA and EPA you need. Okay. That's a first point. Okay. Second point is to be able to create fish oil with concentrated DHA and EPA in it. Fish oil manufacturers have to get rid of all the heavy metals like mercury, the PCBs, and all the toxins that are now in the ocean. And how do they do that? They have to heat the oil up to a really high temperature in a process called molecular distillation. And what I didn't tell you before, the secret of omega-3 and omega-6 fats, their special molecular structure, it's damaged by light, heat, and oxygen. And then you get trans fats. So if you have a look at a bottle of fish oil, it'll say maybe refined or triple refined, heavy metals are taken out of it. But they don't at this point in time have a legal obligation to say X amount of trans fats in the product.
Really?
Yes. So this is, once again, God in the details. If we have enough of the plant-based form of omega-3, and we have it in the right ratio with omega-6, which we can get to in a moment, and we have enough of it in our body and enough of the cofactors to do that conversion into what comes in fish oil, DHA and EPA, we then get two bonuses. We get the bonus of having the plant-based compounds to be used for lots of other things in the body. Second bonus, we get the EPA and DHA in the quantity that our body and brain knows it needs, and it's not damaged. So that's part of this discussion. It's a little bit complex, but yeah, you're getting to the nitty-gritty, the granular level of this now.
So the omega-3s and omega-6, those help fuel the brain, and those helped the neurons to communicate, the synapses to fire. So what's the difference then between, because you were talking about energy and you said glucose is fuel for the brain, that's energy. Ketones are fuel for the brain, that's energy. Is there a difference in the energy versus these communications of neurons, or is it kind of all one and the same?
No, it's not the same. Those essential fats are primarily there for the structure of the brain.
For the brain structure. Okay.
The brain structure. So when the structure is functioning optimally, when those neuronal membranes are made up of the right kinds of fats, and the myelin, which covers the axon, which allows for communication. And the synapses are full of the right kinds of fats. That's the structure of the brain that is impacted and can work beautifully. And then when the fuel, the energy comes in, either glucose or ketones, then those neurons can use it optimally, because then they're functioning optimally. So we're really talking about structure first in terms of the omega fats. People can be converted to be used as energy as well, but that's another conversation, and it's not actually necessary. Primarily, it's the structure, Ryan, that's important.
I never thought about it that way, that there had to be a structure. It's almost like it could almost be considered like a metaphor for the human body in a way, right? Like if you're talking about the human body, not the brain itself, like the muscles, the tendons, the bones, that's that structure. Yeah. And when you're talking about building muscles, you're talking about like protein that's going for muscle synthesis. Well, that's different than function and energy, right? Like energy is the usage of the structure that's been created. So in a way, which also is glucose and ketones in a lot of ways for the energy part of the body. I mean, do I kind of have that right?
Yeah, you do, because what most people don't realize is that the structure and the function of the brain are intimately interconnected. So you can't be feeding your brain certain kinds of nutrients and the structure isn't functioning. So that's why I started with the fats and oils. I had to start with what the structure was. And, 78% of the brain is made up of water. And, these percentages are thrown around. But so if you suffer from dehydration, that's again going to impact the structure of the brain. So the fats and oils and the water is part of the structure. Protein also forms part of the structure. And that's also important. And it works with creating neurotransmitters, because protein, once it gets broken down into its constituents, are actually just a whole lot of amino acids. And those amino acids get built up in the body in a certain way to make neurotransmitters. So that's where protein fits in. But you also have protein in the actual membrane, the structure of the neuron. So yeah, you got it spot on. That structure is kind of like the skeleton, that we have, our bones and our muscles. And then the energy works within our cells. So yeah, that's a good analogy.
So if you're talking about your brain operating at an optimal level, right? Like say there's no trauma and it's just you or I sitting here having a conversation, wanting to have the most engaging conversation possible, trying to optimize our brain function so that we can be as engaged as possible. What are the 3 most important things that we should be thinking about on a daily basis doing to fuel that functionality?
Okay, great question. I think we've answered one of them. One of the pillars is the right kinds of fat. Very, very important. The right kinds of fat is the structure. I've answered the second one in a weird way, discussing protein, because protein and gut health are intimately connected. And protein takes a little bit longer and is a little bit more complex to digest in the gut, just because it's really concentrated, especially if it's from animal origin. So gut health is extremely, extremely important to make sure that what we're eating is getting into the brain, because you've got to break the food down, then it gets absorbed into your bloodstream. Then we've got to cross the blood-brain barrier, which we will get back to, because I loved that question in the beginning. And then it gets, used by the brain. So the gut is very, very important. And third point, the kind of carbs we eat. Now, if people are cutting down on carbs, this is a bit of a challenging thing for them to accept, because the colorful carbs that we should be eating and that we do have robust evidence to support their intake contain a lot of really important nutrients that the brain needs. So we have, for example, antioxidants. So these you find in things like berries, okay, brightly colored fruit, things like kiwi fruit and pomegranates, antioxidants. Why do we need antioxidants? We need antioxidants because the brain is the greediest organ. It produces the most amount of energy in the body, and there's no free lunch. With the creation of all that energy, we have free radicals. And antioxidants protect the brain from damage via the free radicals. So we need those antioxidants. Okay.
What are free radicals? Because I've heard that term thrown out a lot.
Okay, let's just think about this. When your brain is producing energy, or any cell in the whole body is producing energy, in the process of producing energy, it has to kick off something. It releases something. Like when you're going down the road with your car, it releases some exhaust gas. Let's just use that as an analogy, as a
Yeah.
process of moving forward. So the same thing happens with the cells. And these free radicals are really very unstable little guys. They're unstable because they're missing an electron. And so they
Mhm.
look to become stable again. And they find some other compound to steal an electron from, some other cell, some other oxidant to steal an electron from, and then they feel good, but then they've created another free radical. So it's basically a domino effect of electron instability. That is what a free
Okay.
radical is. But when we eat a diet that's very, very high in antioxidants, we are basically saying to the free radicals that are being produced regardless because they're producing energy. We're saying to them, hey guys, we're going to give you electrons. So antioxidants come along and they hand out electrons to the free radicals so they don't have to cause a cascade of ongoing damage. And that's why colorful carbs are extremely important. And antioxidants that are fat soluble, because the fat soluble antioxidants like vitamin A, which comes from beta carotene, which you find in carrots, that gets lodged in the fatty cell membranes and goes and does its work within the cell membrane. So it does double duty in a sense because it's not water soluble like vitamin C is and gets used up a lot. As an aside, Ryan, just to tell you, just to give you an idea about the importance of antioxidants, vitamin C is the most concentrated form of antioxidants that the brain and the adrenal glands possess. We've got 15 times more vitamin C in the brain and the adrenal glands than in all other body tissue.
Really?
Absolutely.
So should we be supplementing with vitamin C?
Good question. I do supplement with vitamin C. I'm very fussy about the kind of supplement that I use. I actually take 3 different kinds and I combine them so I get a maximum dose, and I take some in the morning and some in the afternoon. And that's just because I know how important they are. And they're also great for skin, vitamin C, because it helps build collagen. So that's something else to keep in mind.
The most common vitamin C supplements that I find, because like thinking about, you have a sick kid or you're coming down with something, the easiest way to kind of get vitamin C, which is always known to, I guess, stave off colds and illness, is like the packages that you put in water and you just open it up and you throw them in the water. It dissolves in the water. And I've thought about this because I use those to supplement with vitamin C. But when you read those, I mean, they're kind of like sugar drinks in a way, just because of that. They want folks to be able to drink them and enjoy them, I guess, or at least get them down. Is that the best way to supplement with vitamin C, or is there another way to do so?
Look, I don't like them either because they're full of sugar and they increase compliance. So people swallow them, but sugar is also toxic to the body and brain via other mechanisms. So that's why I make my own. So I take a combination of, ascorbic acid, which is horrendous to taste, and I mix it with a powder form of raw vitamin C that comes from some of the top forms of vitamin C. And then I mix it with one that's got a little bit of an orange flavor, but a natural flavor. And I put those 3 together and I get the best of all the worlds. So yeah, I'm just very fussy about that because I know about that. And I'll share that with you separately via email if you'd like to have a look.
I'd love that.
But Ryan, just to get back to the question, because I sidetracked us a little bit, about the colorful carbs. When we eat colorful carbs, we're also getting a whole lot of other things. We're getting magnesium, we're getting zinc, we're getting iron from some forms of plant. We're getting a lot of Bs, and we need Bs for the brain because Bs help the brain produce energy. So colorful carbs, gut health, and the right kinds of fats are extremely important. And those are the 3 things I think that people need to keep in mind in terms of brain health. Because if you don't have that foundation right, then you're going to have a problem. And this is the challenge with the brain, Ryan. The brain is so sophisticated and sensitive that it will do workarounds for decades before people get symptoms that it can no longer do workarounds. So by the time people get symptoms, dementia, Alzheimer's is the most prevalent form of the dementias, by the time that happens, the brain has been trying for upwards of 2 decades to work around the damage, to work around the deficiencies. And by the time those deficiencies and those workarounds don't work anymore, to then try and fix the brain becomes a hugely challenging task, because then the structure has started breaking down severely. And then you're working really with tissues that can't really respond. So part of my mission is to get people to understand that very sobering fact, that they work on prevention. But we both know prevention isn't something that most people find palatable. But the sad thing is they're going to experience the negativity and the badness at the end of that road because of not caring about prevention.
Yes. And dementia and Alzheimer's. So are dementia and Alzheimer's, are they a structural breakdown of the brain, or is it more the functionality of it?
Once again, the two go together. Once the structure starts breaking down, the functioning can no longer occur. And the structure starts breaking down because what happens is that the neurons don't have enough of the nutrients to work optimally. There's also generally a lot of cortisol that has been released in the body and brain, which has caused inflammation. When that happens, neurons start dying, Ryan. And then the neuron next to the neuron that's died will die. And then they'll start dying off, and you'll have patches in the brain that just have dead matter. And then the brain does a workaround. And, you know, you spoke about your granddad and the stroke. We now know that people that have strokes can regain most of the function that they lose because the brain does a workaround. It says, hey, you know, this part won't work, but we can make some connections here and we can make it work, which is what makes the brain so magnificent. But with Alzheimer's, it's different because that breakdown continues decade after decade after decade. And then you have nothing to work with because the structure's gone and so the function's gone by default.
Is there a way to know, or a way to observe if you're starting to kind of have some sort of breakdown and you're on the track of dementia or Alzheimer's? Or is the brain just so good at bypassing it that there really is no way to tell?
No, we can tell. And there are some really smart people out there that through laboratory tests can check. And they're looking at some blood markers now that can maybe show that you're getting it. So you don't have to have, lie in a scanner. But functional magnetic resonance imaging can show. And SPECT can also show parts of the brain that are no longer being lit up and being used. And then you can see very clearly that, you know, things aren't working well there. So people can go from a really young age. They can go from their early 40s and go and have these scans done if there's maybe a history, a genetic, component to, the cognitive decline maybe in their family. But prevention is always better than cure. And even having a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's doesn't mean you're going to get it, because the environment switches the gene on or not. So just knowing these things really sets us up for success. And there is some research on people actually getting better from Alzheimer's, but it can't be at a very advanced stage. And you have to be, the protocol is a very serious protocol. And there's a researcher, Dr. Bredesen, and I'll send you the link to his book and his website. He's done some groundbreaking research in this area. But not everybody has access to that protocol, and not everyone will be disciplined enough to do the protocol. And, I always speak, with my psychology hat on now. By the time someone gets to that point, they may be really despondent and depressed and not have the actual courage to step up and go into this protocol with everything that it requires from them, because it does. So once again, we're back to prevention for 99% of us.
So is the protocol similar to the prevention? I would imagine the protocol is very specific, especially to be scientifically studied, because there has to be blinds and there has to be a certain way of doing things and different amount of patients. So is this protocol, is it very similar to what you're talking about with having the right carbs, having the right fats, staying hydrated, protein for structure? What does this protocol look like?
Let's just step back for one moment. One of the things that happens, we know now that Alzheimer's basically occurs for one of three reasons. Okay, the first one is nutrient deficiency. Okay.
Okay.
The second one is blood glucose instability, which is linked to nutrient deficiency, because if you're not eating the right nutrients, then your blood glucose will definitely be fluctuating more and more. And the third one is through a fungal infection via the nose, which is interesting, and which there are ways to solve that. So that's basically just stepping back for the three primary reasons. And that can, of course, all be interlinked. So when you're looking at the protocol, you obviously need to be negating all those three pillars. So what you would be doing, you would be making sure that the diet is optimally full of nutrient-dense nutrients. Okay, that your diet would have to be that, firstly. The second thing, which would naturally stem from that, would be your blood glucose would remain stable. But this is what I mentioned about ketones earlier. When the brain is in a very degraded state, it often would battle to use glucose efficiently. So then the protocol says, hey, we have to start letting the brain use ketones as a form of fuel. So that is part of that protocol. And then the third one would be, stemming any of the fungal infection. So that's basically the third one. But the protocol, you could live according to the protocol and negate the need for the protocol, because the case studies show that people definitely do benefit, but they never get back to where they would have been if they didn't have that degradation. So I suggest to people that they live kind of like according to the protocol, but without the ketones, because you don't have to have the ketones.
That makes sense. So you've talked about the gut a couple times, and the gut to me is one of the most interesting areas of science in any niche at this point, or subspecialty. And it's been said that the gut is the second brain. Is it because of all the neurons that are in the intestines, I believe, or nerve endings that are in the intestines? But it communicates so well with the brain. And I love the idea of fueling your brain with food, because it really does start with the gut as well.
Absolutely, it does. And the gut has been neglected for way too long, unfortunately. But now we're getting into it, and we know that it's extremely important. The thing to remember about the gut is that it's actually our first line of defense in our immune system. It's the part of our body that gets first dibs on whatever is in the environment at a very intimate level, right at that cell-gut interface. But, and this is the challenge, that lining that we have in our gut is a very, very sensitive lining, and it depends for its well-being on the bacteria in the gut. When we don't have the right kinds of bacteria in the gut, that very sensitive and very delicate gut lining starts breaking down. And then what happens is undigested food particles find their way into our bloodstream, because the tiny little cells start separating, okay? They're not working as they should. They're very sophisticated and very sensitive. Then when that undigested food particle finds its way into the bloodstream, the body says, whoa, we don't recognize this, and an immune response is initiated. And the immune response travels all the way up to the blood-brain barrier. So we're back to this point. And then that inflammatory response damages the blood-brain barrier. So it becomes less capable of keeping out toxins that would damage the brain. And then the toxins cross over and they cause inflammation inside the brain. And that is a very simplified explanation for what happens in a damaged gut. It causes inflammation that travels up to the brain and then impacts the brain.
Is that undigested? Is that leaky gut? Is that what that's considered, or is that different?
That's the name we give it. We give it leaky gut, because now the gut cannot function optimally, and it's not doing its job because the bacteria inside the gut are not working properly. It's estimated that we need up to 4,000 different kinds of bacteria in our gut to be optimally healthy. And that is a lot of gut bacteria. But one of the reasons we don't get that proliferation of the good gut bacteria is because we're not eating enough colorful carbs with a whole lot of fiber. The fiber is actually the food for the bacteria. So the fiber is actually what we term prebiotics. That's better than probiotics, because swallowing probiotics is just going second in line. Feed the good bacteria. You don't have to eat probiotics. You just feed the good bacteria. They proliferate and they do their job. And this is partly why people have gotten so excited about the gut, because we now know that when your gut bacteria are working well, they'll create a lot of serotonin. And everyone knows serotonin is good. So 90% of the serotonin that is produced in our body is produced in our gut.
Wow.
And that's called peripheral serotonin, by the way. It's peripheral. There is a form of serotonin, the other 10 to 15% that's produced within the brain, which is different to the serotonin in the gut. But the serotonin in the gut is absolutely critical to be produced as well. And we also get some other neurotransmitters that are created in the gut. And that's in answer to your question, Ryan. Sorry, a long answer. Why it's also called the second brain.
So the best way to get colorful veggies and fruits and carbs within your diet, in my opinion, is smoothies. You could just really pack them in. You can get as much as you want, and you can really take a high volume. It's like a dense, nutritious meal, right? But I have heard that smoothies, when you're using like a high power blender, eliminates the fiber in those carbs. Is that an issue, or is that not a big deal?
I actually wrote a blog post about the 3 problems with smoothies. And one of the problems is, and this actually relates to the fiber as well, is not chewing the smoothie. Now, I know this is counterintuitive. I've got a son who just skulls his smoothies, and I keep on saying to him, hey, mate, don't do that. Just chew them a bit, because when we chew them, we actually cover those food molecules with saliva, which starts the digestion process. So that's the first thing. The second thing that happens when people put an enormous amount of nutrients within that smoothie, which I'm all for nutrient density, don't get me wrong. The problem is that if they scull it, they actually don't register satiation, that they're full for a while. Okay. Now that's not really a problem. But what can happen if it's too dense? Then they miss a meal. Then they, running on empty later. So I think there's a bit of a balance there. The solution to the problem is to put some chewables on top of the smoothie, and that's what I do. So I make a seriously nutrient-dense smoothie, but I don't make it too big. And on top of it, I will put activated almonds or walnuts or pecan or macadamias, and I force myself to chew them, or otherwise some berries that haven't been mushed, because I know that I'm serving my brain and my gut and my digestive system just by the saliva by doing that.
Yeah, and I would imagine that the nuts, if you're doing the cashews, almonds, that's also high in healthy fat too. So that's like that structural thing that really would benefit as well with the brain. So
absolutely, Ryan. And it's not hard to get into that habit. So look, I'm a big fan of smoothies if we use them properly.
Yeah. So what is the best smoothie recipe?
Oh, look. I like a smoothie that's got greens in it. So I can stick some kale in. I stick some spinach in, some lettuce as well. My mama thinks I'm insane, but I stick lettuce in. Always berries. I love berries. I put coconut yogurt in my smoothie. I put some hemp seeds in it. I add some nuts. I really like using coconut, frozen coconut chunks. Sometimes I throw half a banana in and maybe a date. If you really want to up it, you just put a little bit of vanilla in it, just a drop of vanilla, and it's really great. But I also like frozen oranges and mandarins, and I keep the peel, because the peel, when it's organic, that is, has got the highest concentration of antioxidants, because that's where the plant needs most of the antioxidants. And then you get a really beautiful citrusy flavored smoothie. So it's heavenly.
The peel the peel of the orange or the mandarin.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Absolutely.
Really?
Fabulous.
Well, I would imagine you'd have to chew that as well. But I mean, orange zest though, like orange, I've cooked with orange zest, and you shave it off, and it actually has that unbelievable citrus flavor. It would actually add to the smoothie. I've never done it that way.
Yeah, and I just chop them up. So I take the orange, just give it a good wash, and it's all organic. Chop it up in slivers, stick it in the freezer, and chuck it in the smoothie. It's fantastic. I also make a pretty good banoffee smoothie. That's my husband's favorite. So I'd make it with banana, with organic coffee, and I put a lot of coconut milk with that, and I whiz that up. And I try to tell him that when it's green, it still tastes the same.
Does it?
And yeah, it does, because the green doesn't really detract from it. The coffee really, gives it a good flavor. So there are a few really good smoothies, but I try and focus on the nutrient density.
Yeah. So look, you wrote this, and I need to say the name of your book as well. I know it's at the beginning of this, but you wrote this amazing book, Feed the Brain: 7 Steps to a Lighter, Brighter You. And obviously, nutrition is going to be one of the best ways that you could feed your brain. It's one of the best ways you can feed your gut. But that's also not the only thing you've written about. The first chapter of the book is actually called Sweat, Sleep, Sex, and Stress. How do sweat, sleep, sex, and stress actually affect the brain?
Well, I love this question. It's quite funny, because when I spoke to my publisher about the book, I wanted to put fats and oils right in the front of the book, because I said, look, that's the structure, that's important. They said, no, sex sells. So we stopped and we put the first chapter of what I was going to have at the end at the front. But look, it all works together. So the first thing, let's just discuss sleep for a second. Sleep is integral for brain health, because if we don't sleep, our brain can't clean itself. And that's a whole nother discussion in itself, but sleep is really critical. So that's number one. Let's just add sex to that. As human beings, we really gravitate towards community and connection. And when you have someone that you really love and that is in your corner, and you can enjoy intimacy with that person, it sets off a beautiful cascade of wonderful neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin and serotonin and dopamine, all of which nourish the brain beautifully. So when I talk to people and they tell me they're too tired for sex, I say, look, I know that you may be too tired for sex, but just think about all the benefits for your brain and body that you get. So that's that in that chapter, I discuss that, or that section. As far as sweat goes, basically I'm speaking about exercise, and, enjoying exercise as much as you do and having had a career in it, you'll know that when you exercise, your brain actually feels better. You lift your mood because of the endorphin release. Not only that, but deep within the brain, we are creating a compound called brain-derived neurotropic factor when we exercise. Now, BDNF is super powerful. It's like fertilizer for neurons. It helps neurons become more bushy and more connected to their neighbors. So we want lots of BDNF. The other thing with exercise, it actually helps reduce our stress level. So when you're moving, you're getting rid of adrenaline and cortisol. It helps your body. And the thing is that our body speaks to our brain all the time. And it does that via a number of really complex processes, but it also does that through the vagal nerve. And the vagal nerve is a very important nerve, because most of the communication in the vagal nerve goes from the body to the brain. And when we exercise and we reduce our stress, the vagus nerve tells the brain things are good, release these hormones, release these neurotransmitters. Movement is extremely important for the brain. We get ourselves out of poor mood when we exercise. We reduce our chance of getting depression, blah, blah, blah. So I could go on about that. So that's important. Stress is another important issue, because we live in a really complex, challenging world, and we need to find a way to balance our stress. But that's another complex subject. I did a PhD on that. So we can't go down that road right now.
So I can tell you that unequivocally, exercise, sweat, it is a game changer in terms of my mental performance on a daily basis. But it's one thing for me to say, like, yes, I feel better. Yes, I feel smarter. I feel like I could do more. I mean, has it been studied where brain function and performance is increased either directly after physical activity or through like daily habitual activity?
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies about that. And there's actually a great book. I think it's called Spark. I'll send you the link. And the person that wrote the book did an enormous amount of research into exercise. So there is a lot of robust evidence to show that our body and our brain work together, and exercise is super beneficial for that. So I often say to people, when they speak about mood disorders, I say it's a lack of movement disorder, because once you're moving your body, your brain really sees a different perspective. And the other funny thing from a psychological perspective, Ryan, when you move, you actually have to look up and look at the horizon regularly. It shifts your perspective from looking inwards and being morbid and depressed, which people do when their mood is low. So how's that for a little tip?
I love that. It's the most true statement I've heard. It's when you're looking down, when you're depressed you're within yourself, you're looking inward at what's going on in your own body. But to work out, if you're trying to move your body, you do have to find the horizon and have that balance. And it's that balance that's so great for your whole life, right? Because it's taking you out of your own head, out of your own body, and putting you back into the world, which, man, that's a really cool way to think about it.
That's when I think my psychology training wasn't a waste all those years.
So what are the best 5 foods you could eat to optimize your brain health?
Oh, this is a good question. Best 5 foods. Look, berries have to take number 1. Berries are really great. Making sure you get the right fats. That's critical. And it's not just the seeds. There actually is a supplement that you can take. And I've used it for 25 years.
Okay.
So I'll tell you about that, via email as well, and you can share it with your audience if you want to. And I've checked it out. Seriously, it's the best one that I can find.
It's a fat supplement?
Yeah, it's a fat supplement. And it's really produced. It's organic, no trans fats. The factory. My husband actually went to the factory to check it out. So I speak about it, it's really a great product. Making sure that the carbs that we eat are full of fiber. Okay. And so I can basically speak about things like broccoli, things like pumpkin, things like oranges, kiwi fruit, pomegranate, lots of fiber, and the color, definitely important. So let's just lump that together. Protein. If people choose animal products, they have to be organic because pesticides accumulate in fat. And pesticides are directly linked to Parkinson's. We know that from research. So we want to eliminate pesticides specifically in fat-soluble food. So plant protein, not that fussy about it being, free of pesticides. I do choose that, but animal forms of protein have to be organic. They just have to be. And we've gone. That's given us 4, hasn't it?
You put a bunch in those too. So if you're saying you have to choose one organic item from the store, and you can't afford both, they don't have both, whatever it is, you're going to choose the animal protein organic item over the produce any day?
Yes, because you can get rid of some of the pesticides on produce by soaking it in water with a bit of vinegar. You get rid of some of the external pesticides. But remember that pesticides are actually systemic. They go into the product as well. So you get rid of some of the surface ones, but absolutely always choose what the fat-soluble product is. In this case, animal protein that has to be organic.
Good to know. And what are the 5... Go ahead.
Sorry, Ryan. And just one thing to mention, whenever I see articles about brain food, I always see salmon. And salmon used to be fabulous brain food. It really did. But our oceans today are truly toxic, and they've been decimated by overfishing. So I made a commitment a while ago after watching Seaspiracy, the documentary, to not eat fish anymore.
Really?
And yeah, I did. And it was a hard decision because I love fish, but I really decided that I needed to make a stand with that. So I no longer recommend fish as a primary choice for brain
What about
health.
Something like scallops or crustaceans? Same thing?
Well, it depends where they've been grown. If they've been grown in water that's clean, it's hard to know whether the water is clean. The oceans are really quite toxic. So I have a problem with that. And I just always say to people, look, don't rely on that as a form of your, as brain food, as your protein for brain food, because it doesn't have a lot of omega-3 in it anymore either, because so much of it is now factory farmed. So you're not even getting the benefit that you thought you were getting.
So what are the 5 foods to avoid for optimal brain health?
Okay, this is a little easier. The first one is fried food. Any food that's been fried, you've got the damage first of the oil that was used to fry it, which is toxic to start with, and then you heat it up and it gets more toxic. So that's fried food, definitely. Second one, processed food. Processed food has got a lot of chemicals in it, which are toxic to the brain, and it's devoid of fiber. So you want to avoid that. Third one, foods with a lot of sugar in, which can also be related to number 2. So that would be sugar in the actual product. It will be sugar in a drink, sugar in lollies and in chocolates. Definitely avoid that. Oh, let's just add chocolate to the good list. The dark
I'll
chocolate
take
to the good
that.
list. Yeah.
But I'm
Okay,
assuming it's not chocolate like a Snickers bar.
Not chocolate like a Snickers bar, no. In my book, I've actually got a recipe to make chocolate with fiber in it. And it doesn't taste like it's got fiber in it. It's really, really yummy. When I used to give in-person presentations, I would take a big tub of it to people and say, look, this isn't about deprivation. It's about yumminess. Okay, so we've got 3 there, Ryan. I don't think there's anything else, actually. I think that covers all the bases. I think people often ask me about alcohol. I think the thing about alcohol is, if it's wine, rather choose organic red wine. It's higher in antioxidants, so that's a better choice. Always ask yourself if you're drinking to get rid of a problem or you're drinking to enhance your life. That's just a question, personal question, because when people are very stressed, they can drink a lot, and alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. So that just makes them feel worse. I think that basically covers it all. I mean, obviously we spoke about pesticides. Trying to avoid pesticides is really important because the brain is sensitive to that. But I think fried foods, processed foods, sugary foods, I think that covers the base.
Should the average person be doing blood work or doing anything to find out if they're lacking nutrients and minerals in their diet?
I recommend that, yes, because if you don't and you supplement, you're basically, shooting in the dark. So when you do blood work with a functional practitioner, you find out what you're low in, maybe what you've got too much of. I know most people are deficient in vitamin D, just don't get enough sun anymore. A lot of people are deficient in essential fats. You can check for that in blood work as well, although you can check on your skin to see whether you're deficient in that. It's a faster barometer. A lot of people are deficient in iron. It's the most common nutrient deficiency in the world, specifically women. So you can check for that. So I definitely recommend people get their blood work done. And also hormones. When women are having challenges with their hormones, a lot of PMT, or when they go into menopause, absolutely get a check then. And even men who are feeling a little bit weak and that they're not feeling powerful and confident, sometimes men go through stages where they've got low testosterone. So it's worthwhile checking that as well. So I definitely recommend blood work. I do it myself every 6 months. I just keep myself on track, know what I need to tweak or not. And that's one of the secrets.
Yeah. Other than food, what's the most important thing we can do to improve our cognition and our brain health?
Okay. Apart from what we spoke about, which was sleep, sex, sweating, and the last one is one that I'll focus on. One of the best things to do for cognitive health is to manage our stress. And I don't like the word manage. I think we need to work on stress resiliency. We do live in a very complex and challenging world today. We really do. And a lot of people have realized that in the last 18 plus months with this pandemic hitting us. And figuring out really what your values are is extremely important. So when I do group coaching, I do that. I speak to people about their values because our values drive our priorities. And when we spend a lot of time, fiddling with things that aren't important and don't align with our overall vision for our life, we waste a lot of time and energy. And we also get stressed about things that we actually have no control over. So, by watching the news, all you do is irritate yourself, get frustrated, and get really stressed because you see people making decisions that you don't think are right. Whichever side of the political spectrum you sit on, politicians are very seldom people's favorite people. So we need to reduce our stress significantly. And one of the ways, as I said, values, priorities. And then you look at what you can control, because cortisol is a hugely damaging compound when it occurs in high levels in the body and the brain. We know that cortisol is directly responsible for reducing the size of the hippocampus in the brain, which is our memory center. And so when people go through a really stressful period, they can't find their keys. They can't find where they left something. They can't remember the person's name. And that's because the hippocampus is slowly getting smaller and smaller with high levels of cortisol. So I suggest to people they become more stress resilient. It's a great thing for body and brain.
That's crazy. So I didn't realize. So stress can actually affect your memory.
Absolutely, Ryan, directly. It affects it directly. And if it's been going on for months and months and months, it gets harder and harder for the brain to grow new neurons in the hippocampus, which is the second of only 2 places in the brain where we can grow new neurons. Hippocampus,
Wow.
definitely. Yeah.
So, should we be working out our brain like we work out our body? I mean, what are like the best 3 brain exercises if we're supposed to be working out on our brain?
Great question. There's a lot of brain enhancing or brain exercising activities out there. People do like software things and, little computer things. There's some evidence to support some of them having some benefit. But overall, what seems to work is travel. Travel is great for the brain because the brain gets to a new place. It's got to figure out new things. If it can be in another language, even better for you to learn the language. So change is great for the brain. The other thing is increasing our knowledge. So reading, not watching Netflix, learning a new skill, learning to play an instrument, learning a new sport. All of these things grow the brain and give us what we call cognitive reserve. And when our brain has got more things it's involved in and interested in, I always tell people to play ball sports. Because with ball sports, you don't really know where the ball's going. And so your brain is continuously figuring out, hey, where's it going to land? Whereas if you do other kinds of sports, they're pretty predictable. And we want to get blood flow and oxygen to all parts of the brain. And we do that by using our body in new and novel ways, because that means that, by default, we get oxygen and blood to different parts. So, yeah,
I love
those
it.
are things people can do.
What's the most exciting new research that you've heard about that's impacting our brain health?
Look, I come across a lot of it, but I read something the other day which was really fascinating, and I've known this for a while, but they did some research on people who were suffering from jet lag. And even after one night of disturbed sleep, the gut bacteria were negatively influenced. One night of poor sleep. And I was like, wow, just one night, the gut bacteria picked that up. So for me, that was pretty standout. And I thought, sure, that was interesting. But I do come across a lot of stuff. I came across something a while ago, which a lot of people don't know. And people that opt into my email list have learned this, is that we suffer from something called email apnea. Every time we open up a new email, we hold our breath.
Really?
We don't know why we do that. It's the weirdest thing. So I tell people to unsubscribe a lot, because if every single time you're opening up an email, you're holding your breath a lot, and that is a stress response to the body. So only subscribe to what you love.
So that brings up another interesting question is, how does breathing affect the brain?
Breathing is extremely important for the brain, obviously, to keep it oxygenated, because we die very quickly if we don't have oxygen. But our rate of breathing tells our brain whether we're stressed or not via the vagus nerve too. So breathing works according to simplify it, right? Let's do this. We've got an autonomic nervous system that does things basically automatically. And within that, we've got the sympathetic nervous system, which I call the stress nervous system. And we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest nervous system. Okay, we've got those two.
Okay.
Now, we're supposed to be in the PNS more than in the SNS. That's the way the body works. Being more in PNS leaves us healthier than being in SNS all the time. But most people are in SNS. When we breathe in, we stimulate SNS. And when we breathe out, we stimulate PNS. So I teach people how to breathe so they're not stimulating SNS, but rather PNS. So that means your in-breath needs to be shorter than your out-breath. And that's the simplest lesson to learn. And the more you focus on doing that, the better your breathing becomes. And it becomes just a neural pathway that you build for yourself because, hey, suddenly you're feeling calmer a lot more because your PNS is being stimulated. And the other trick is to do a lot of laughing, because when you laugh, your PNS switches on automatically. You cannot have an SNS and laughter on at the same time. No way. That's how people have healed themselves, with laughter.
That's crazy. And I did read a book recently by, I believe it was James Nestor, called Breathe.
Yes,
I read the James Nestor book Breathe,
yes.
and it seems like it's kind of what you're saying, is that the short breathe in and the long breathe out. I think what I remember it saying was that it was increasing your CO2 level versus your O2 level. Is that right, or is that or,
The way he explains it is that CO2 isn't really the enemy, because CO2 tells our body and our brain what the level of O2 should be. And I think a lot of people are
okay?
really nervous about carbon dioxide. So it's actually our friend, because it tells us when to breathe deeply and so on. But what the important thing that his book said, which ties in with the PNS story, is when we breathe deeply, we actually access PNS fibers, which are lower down in our lungs versus at the top. And it's one of the reasons when people breathe very shallowly, they end up feeling more anxious and stressed. And, we've both probably experienced that. You
Yeah,
go, and you feel
yeah.
bad. But when you breathe deeply, you get your PNS activated. And that's why I loved his book, because he explained that to people. So I was like, yeah, great.
Yes. Well, Delia, this has been so much fun. And I do have a couple of questions that I ask everybody at the end, but I feel like I've learned so much. And I encourage everybody to get out and to check out your book. It's fantastic. Feed Your Brain, 7 Steps to a Lighter, Brighter You, as well as your cookbook. So where can people find you?
Ryan, they can find me at my website, which is lighterbrighteryou.life, or just lby.life. And I'm on Instagram as well. I don't have a huge following there, but I just post recipes and stuff. It's more like a place for me to remind myself of the recipes and the things that are important. And when I speak on summits and so on, and podcasts like yours, I put it up on Instagram. And I'm really happy for people to send me emails and ask me questions, because I love chatting about this stuff. And I want everyone to become passionate about feeding the brain.
Yeah, and all of those links will be in the show notes for anyone that wants to reach out to you. So, final 3 questions. What's the most impactful book you've ever read?
Oh my goodness, that's a terrible question, Ryan. I read a lot and I found amazing books, but I'll tell you my most recent great read.